Respected Professor Esposito, respected Rector, Your Excellencies, Ambassadors, colleagues, professors, students and pupils, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Assalamu alaikum and good evening.
Dobrodošli na prvo predavanje Centra za dijalog u okviru foruma Minber ili govornica. Naš gost večeras je počasni doktor Univerziteta u Sarajevu, profesor John Esposito. Neki od vas su čuli danas o profesoru Espositu u rektoratu, zbog onih koji nisu, ja ću samo kratko podsjetiti da je profesor Esposito vodeće ime u oblasti savremenih islamskih studija, da je profesor na Georgetown univerzitetu u Washingtonu i direktor Centra Princ El Velid bin Talal za Muslimansko-kršćansko razumijevanje. Trenutno je i predsjednik Američke akademije za religiju. Dobitnik je više prestižnih nagrada, uključujući i nagradu Američke akademije za religiju 2005. godine. Sam ili sa drugim kolegama napisao je više od 50 knjiga i preko 100 članaka. Urednik je nekoliko značajnih referentnih dijela iz islamistike, među kojima i Oksfordska enciklopedija savremenog islamskog svijeta u 6 tomova i serijala Oksfordska biblioteka islamskih studija. Njegove knjige su prevedene na više od 35 jezika, a na bosanski, hrvatski i srpski jezik prevedeno je najmanje 5 njegovih naslova. Savjetnik je američke i brojnih drugih vlada, velikih korporacija, agencija i medija za islam i islamske pokrete. Gostovao je na svim značajnijim medijima. Sveukupno profesor Esposito već nekoliko decenija personificira onu školu u islamskim i bliskoistočnim studijama koja promovira ideju saradnje nasuprot sukoba civilizacija. Zbog toga je večeras sa nama.
Poštovani profesor Esposito, predstavnici vjerskih zajednica, članovi akademske zajednice i diplomatskog kora, predstavnici medija, poštovani prijatelji, assalamu alaikum i dobroveče. Centar za dijalog Vesatijja osnovao je Sabor islamske zajednice u Bosni i Hercegovini polovinom 2012. godine. Time je islamska zajednica još jednom potvrdila svoje opredjeljenje za dijalog, i onaj međumuslimanski i onaj međureligijski. Na današnji dan, 3. oktobra prošle godine, organizirali smo svečano otvaranje centra. Drago mi je da večeras, na godišnjicu otvaranja, a u saradnji sa Institutom za islamsku tradiciju Bošnjaka i Centrom za napredne studije, s ovim predavanjem pokrećemo jednu novu aktivnost, serijal predavanja nazvan Minber, govornica Centra za dijalog. Veliko nam je zadovoljstvo što je prvi izlagač na Minberu profesor John Esposito. Vjerujem da bolji početak nismo mogli imati. Koristim priliku da se zahvalim svima koji su pomogli naš centar u protekloj godini, a posebno našim strateškim partnerima Centru za Vesatiju iz Kuvajta. Zahvaljujem se profesoru što nas je počastio svojim dolaskom i ujedno mu čestitam počasni doktorat koji mu je danas uručio Univerzitet u Sarajevu. Svima vama sam zahvalan na odvojenom vremenu i ukazanom povjerenju. Želim vam ugodan boravak u ovom lijepom zdanju, a profesora pozivam da nam se obrati. Profesore, izvolite.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Hvala
Thank you all
lijepa.
for coming.
Hvala vam lijepa što ste došli.
I would not come out at night to hear anybody speak.
Ja ne bi ovako kasno na večer došao da slušam bilo koga ko nešto govori, tako da sam iznenađen da imamo ovako mnogo ljudi u publici. A mislim da trebamo zaključati vrata tako da niko ne može izaći dok ja ne završim svoje predavanje. Jako mi je drago što sam ovdje, osjećam se izuzetno počastovanim što sam dobio počasnu doktorat sa Univerzitetu Sarajevu danas i kao što sam rekao, ja sam dobio brojne takve doktorate, ali za mene je ovo najznačajniji, najzanimljiviji, za mene je to bilo kulturalno najbitnije iskustvo koje sam doživio. Žao mi što moja supruga nije mogla biti sa mnom danas ovdje. Ja ću govoriti o muslimansko-kršćanskom dijalogu i odnosima 21.
Unless dialogue leads to action, it's a waste of time. Okay? And especially today.
Bez akcije
We've had many years of agreements between major religious leaders.
Mi smo slušali o brojnim dogovorima, različitih međunarodnih, međureligijskih vođa, potpisivali smo razne sporazume, stavljali.
And then we forget about them, and then we revisit it a year or two later. We need to move on. In today's global world, where the lines between East and West, between us and them, between Muslims and Christians, are no longer clearly defined, clearly separated and demarcated. Because of mass communications and global mobility, the need to engage in dialogue is even more urgent and critical than in the past. If we are to have a situation in which we do not escalate marginalization, alienation, confrontation, conflict, and violence. Islam and Christianity are, we know, the two largest religions in the world. 2.2 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims. And they engage each other globally. But equally important, in the last 40 years, Muslims have gone from being invisible in Europe and America to being the second or third largest religion. This coming together, this meeting, is not just one of theology and religion, it's of politics and international relations. It's of stability and security, but it's also of the threat of global terrorism as it has been framed in the recent past. Now, when we approach Muslim-Christian relations, let me start with two principles that we have to get out of the way. When you talk about another one's faith or their culture, you have to compare your ideal to the other person's ideal, not your ideal to somebody else's reality, you see. So I talk about what's great about my culture and my country, but then I point out the problems that you have rather than acknowledging my own problems. We have to avoid a certain form of amnesia. Many people of faith have religious amnesia. Many people who belong to nations have national amnesia. Again, they remember and celebrate all that they've done that they believe is good, and they forget about the fact of the problems of the past. For example, all religions have an extraordinarily good side, and all religions have had a bad side. There is a transcendent side and a dark side. Transcendent side, religion puts you into a connection, a world of meaning, in which you relate to that which transcends you, beyond you. In the Abrahamic traditions, in many different ways, we speak about God, Yahweh, Allah, okay? But at the same time, all of our religious traditions have had a dark side in the past and today. Okay, in the past and today. And that dark side has not just been religious confrontation. It's been often religious connection, but often driven by politics and, as it were, international affairs. When Pope Urban declared the Crusades, he declared God wills it. When some Muslim rulers wanted to spread their empire, they in effect declared the same thing. So there's that interconnection. And we see that even today. Therefore, we know that past history. Depending on where you stand, you could talk about crusades. The other side will talk about jihad. And sometimes people will talk about 14 centuries of, as it were, crusades and neo-colonialism, and others will talk about 14 centuries of jihad. But what gets forgotten is that down through the centuries, in many parts of the world, Muslims and Christians were engaging each other. While the crusades were going on, most people in the world didn't even know they were going on. And Muslims and Christians were trading, they were doing business, etc. We know that historically we've had long periods and areas of coexistence. We've had the notion of convivencia, living together in Andalusia, but we also had it in southern Italy and in different parts of the world, both practically, but also, as it were, in terms of commerce, and even at times in terms of culture and religion. We know that historically, Islamic civilization was indebted to the West for many of the sources, the books that were translated, but then it developed itself and made contributions to science, astronomy, etc. We know all of that, but we need to internalize that. On the other hand, many people in the West have not been aware of that until recently. And that basis became the basis for the West and for Christendom when it came out of the Dark Ages to build its way future. Many of the great Christian theologians, Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, Raymond Lull, as well as scientists, were influenced by that transmission of knowledge. Similarly, Muslims, Christians, and Jews have not only coexisted. I talk pretty quickly for translators. Well, that's their problem. No, they can translate that. Okay. Okay, I'll slow down. I usually, when I'm in Japan, I drive people really crazy with my personality, so I'll try to slow down. Okay. Similarly, Muslims, Christians, and Jews have coexisted not only in Andalusia and Lebanon, but in the Balkans, in Turkey, and one needs to keep that past history in mind, okay? That tension between the constructive and at times the destructive. Now let's move to the 21st century. We live in extraordinary times. When I was a young man, I grew up in cosmopolitan New York, particularly in Brooklyn, okay? Now, this was a major city in the world, it still is. Brooklyn is much better than New York City, but I won't tell you why tonight. Okay. Yet I lived in an Italian ghetto. In New York City, we had an Italian neighborhood, Irish neighborhood, French neighborhood, Jewish neighborhood. When I moved to Massachusetts, we had a Catholic church here and school across the street, another Catholic church and school. Why? One was Irish, one was French. Okay. So in those days, we had a New York that was multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and was cosmopolitan, and yet when people went home, they were living in their own little area. Today, it becomes more and more difficult in our world. With globalization, countries are becoming more multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Look at the struggles in Europe, dealing with going from whatever it is Europeans thought it meant to be European, which usually means white, Caucasian, in many areas white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, to now dealing with multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Multi-ethnic, multi-religious America, which celebrated its pluralism, in the last 30 or 40 years has had to deal with the fact that alongside churches and synagogues, suddenly we have Hindu and Buddhist temples, Sikh temples, and mosques, and peoples coming from those areas. So pluralistic America had a certain notion of what pluralism meant, and suddenly having to absorb that. The situation has become compounded in the last 40 years by the fact that with the global resurgence of religion in different religions, people have not only become more pious, a small percentage of them have become violent, have become terrorists. Okay, so the reality of the 21st century is all of this. And with globalization of communications, we all know what's happening. The slightest little thing can happen in America. I was lecturing in Cairo in the lead up to the Gulf War. Well, there were a couple of Gulf Wars, but okay, I'll let our representative from the embassy separate that out for you during the discussion period. But in any case, it was during one of the Gulf Wars. In the question and answer period, someone got up and didn't just ask me about American foreign policy. They said, how about the Muslims whose homes were raided last night in Virginia? Okay, I live right outside of Virginia. How about, now it turns out that two of my students' families, I didn't know that till I went back to my seminar, were involved in these raids, had their homes raided. My point is that here I was in Cairo, and people in the audience, because of globalization and communications, knew almost instantaneously what had happened. I didn't even know what had happened. So when we now think about atrocities that take place all over the world, unlike years ago where it could take days to get the news, now, unfortunately, in some ways, you can have your dinner and be watching live all kinds of atrocities, bombings, etc. So we live in a smaller and smaller world. Also remember that this is a time in history when you have the largest number of Muslims who are living outside the Muslim world, who have migrated to other areas. Therefore, regardless of our religious and cultural differences, Muslims and Christians in particular in this world as global religions, but also as religious traditions that inform the civilization of countries both in the West and in many parts of the Muslim world, have to look at how do we get along. In Amman a number of years ago, you had a document developed called A Common Word, okay, between us and you. You had major Muslim leaders across the country. Again, only with globalization of communications could you do this. For the first time, they were able to mobilize major Muslim religious leaders, whether they could come to Amman or not, to sign off on a major statement. And that statement was sent to the heads of all the major Christian churches, Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Archbishop of Canterbury, etc. With globalization of communications, one was able to do that. And what did that document actually say? It said, despite our differences, we live in a global world and we share common threats and concerns, whether they're social or whether they're the issues of security and violence. And what we need to affirm is, however different, we share something in common: love of God and love of neighbor. And on the basis of that, we need to build a way forward. Now, that's a great statement. The question is, how do you activate that? How do you operationalize it? So it's not just a statement that exists on the internet, and we can come back to that. So I would put out before you that we not only share principles, beliefs, and values, we share common interests as well, despite our differences. To begin with, in terms of beliefs and values, belief in God, His prophets, revelation, moral responsibility, the sanctity of life, the value of the family, a desire for economic prosperity, but also social justice, a desire for education, technology, peace and security, political participation, and human rights. All of those things are shared in common. And they're not only important religiously, we know they're important politically. Whether you're religious or not, the issue of political participation, human rights, this is something we believe everyone is entitled to. We can differ on some of the issues involved in human rights, but there isn't a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a Hindu, a Buddhist who doesn't want to have their human rights wherever they are, whether in their country or when they're living or traveling in other countries. The challenge then is the question of dialogue and cooperation and activation, realizing that whether we like it or not, and most of us like it, but whether we like it or not, we have a shared future. You cannot have an unshared future. Anything that happens can affect your safety and security, your economy, and your human rights. None of us can say that we're living in isolation anymore. One of the realities of global terrorism is that wherever you are in the world, for the United States, we always were involved in wars someplace else. What 9/11 demonstrated in a very integral way was the extent of our vulnerability in that New York and Washington can be attacked. And we know in today's world of global terrorism, any place and anybody is vulnerable, because it's not just that we're going to have violence and war with big armies that go to a battlefield. Now it can be one person, 4 people, that can make one feel vulnerable. And so the issue not only of how do you find those people, but the issue of how do we attempt to create a world in which not only do we have social justice, but in which we raise people who have both religious principles or, if you will, human value principles and values, and are educated in a way that they will be international citizens rather than international rogue extremist or terrorist. Today there's a growing recognition that building that future is based upon the fact that we all face these challenges, but we also face the opportunities of living in a global world. Globalization, for example, can be a threat economically to many, but globalization can have a plus side. And that we clearly are living, whether we like it or not, in an interdependent world. The fact that Iran is now talking to the US after all of these decades, the fact that Ayatollah Khamenei, who's normally seen as a hardliner, is giving his president and others the marching orders, the right to move forward in engaging the US. The fact that the US is engaged after, they talked about, President Obama talked about, decades of mistrust. He was inaccurate. It was decades of demonization, what I called mutual Satanization. Okay? I mean, it's very much in our experiences of the past, and therefore almost a culture of concern. But both sides realize that putting aside even wonderful beliefs or principles, from the point of view of interest, survival, security, there is a shared future. With regard to Muslims and Christians, I think it's important to underline some of the very specific concerns that people have. Believers in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism, and other faiths, but I'm talking here in terms of the engagement of Muslims and Christians, have a concern about issues of greed, economic injustice, rampant materialism. Materialism's fine. You want to present me with a Mercedes tomorrow? I have no problem with that. But the reality of it is, even a Peugeot would be okay. Well, no, not really. The reality of it is, it's rampant materialism, conspicuous consumption. It's a rampant materialism that, in fact, within a country means you have a disparity between rich and poor, and in the world you have an unacceptable disparity between rich and poor. All believers are concerned with that. Concerned that it threatens the public good. Concerned about ethnic and religious violence and conflicts. Ethnic and religious violence and conflicts. We can be concerned about the rights of Muslims. Not only in the West, but Muslims in their own countries. And here we need only to see how the politics are playing out right now in the Muslim world. We all have to worry about religious extremism, not only out there, but within our own religious communities. Some of it is a religious extremism that is not violent, and some of it is a religious extremism that becomes violent. The basis for cooperation and mutual understanding, for greater unity and the acceptance of diversity, is a more pluralistic outlook. A pluralistic outlook rooted in a rereading of our faith and our scriptures and a recognition of not only our shared values, but our shared interests, political, economic, social. Why pluralism? The world that I grew up in, and that many of my Muslim friends grew up in, was a world that, first of all, liked to talk about love of God and love of neighbor, okay? But the real question is, who is the neighbor? Sometimes when believers in the past said love of God and love of neighbor versus enemy, neighbor was somebody who was like you, of your own faith. And if you look at history, you can see that. We more and more have broadened that notion of neighbor. The world that I grew up in, and certainly of my tradition, and it's also found in Islamic tradition, was, yes, there was a recognition of diversity, but it was also a world which, from my point of view, and here I simply speak from my point of view, was a world in which how we saw other people was in a very limited way. It was celebrating that, thank God, I have the one true faith. I might not always say it that way, but deep down it was, and if I have the one true faith, then what do I conclude about other faiths? A world of pluralism is one which celebrates one's tradition, celebrates the truth of one's tradition, may celebrate and say, I believe that the path that I follow is the best of all possible paths, but that recognizes the presence of God, of human values in other faiths. It is a religious vision that is inclusive, not exclusive. And again, inclusive does not mean that one does not recognize differences, but it means that it's an inclusiveness that realizes the commonality. If one is going to say, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we believe in a God who is compassionate, as well as a just judge, but who is compassionate and merciful, then one has to embrace that pluralistic vision. And clearly, we see a basis for that. Because if Jews and Christians have struggled in recent decades to better define the connection and the reality of a Judeo-Christian tradition, we now know that there is a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. When I went to graduate school, where am I on time? We're okay? Okay. I was trained by Castro and Gaddafi, so we better serve you breakfast. We may be here for at least 8 hours. But when I went to graduate school, I was trained first in Roman Catholic theology. As some of you know, I was a Franciscan for quite a few years, although I've been married 48 years, so it gives you an idea of just how ancient I may be. I think I was born about either 10 years after Jesus or 10 years after Muhammad. It's only at this age that I can even kid about age. I usually talk about the fact that I dye my hair in order to look more mature. But when I went to graduate school, I had my degree in Catholic theology, and I was doing work to finish a degree in religion, and my professor said, study Islam, take a course in Islam. And I thought, why? I want to finish my degree. I'm practical, I'm married. I want to get my degree faster. But also in the late 1960s, my image of Islam and Arabs was based on 1967 war, a movie and a book called The Exodus, which I thought was showing history of the founding of Israel and the problems between Palestinians and Israelis. And that image of Arabs did not make me feel like I wanted to spend 6 months studying about Arab culture and studying Islam. What opened me up was when I suddenly realized there was this other religious tradition, which even then, in academia in the States, we would always talk about Judaism and Christianity here, and then Islam was put with Hinduism and Buddhism. It wasn't seen as one of the great monotheistic traditions. It wasn't seen that Muslims see themselves as rooted in a Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, that Muslims recognize the earlier revelations and prophets. They were put over there with the Hindus and Buddhists. So that was a world that opened up for me. That is a world that more and more is now emerging in our scholarship, in the way that we educate our students. It's still not a world that some believers can accept. I said to a member of my family a while ago, when my mother and father passed away, they had the same priest. They died about 2 years apart from each other. And the priest was from the Philippines. And I was saying to a member of my family, you know, I was talking to Father so-and-so, and he asked me what I did. And I told him about my training, initially as a Franciscan, but that I was a specialist in Islam. And he seemed interested, and I said, well, if you're interested, I have CDs and DVDs of programs that I've done on Islam. And he said, oh yeah, I'd really like to get them. And so I said, well, why do you seem so interested? And he said, I come from a very Catholic family, large family. I think there were 2 priests, maybe 1 nun, 1 sister in the family, you know, religious. And he said, but one day my brother came home and announced that he was a Muslim. And he smiled and said, you can imagine how my family responded to that. Now, they've made their adjustment. When I said this to a member of my family and said, isn't this interesting and isn't it good? There's a kind of opening here. The member of my family said, that's nice, but I would hope that he would pray for his immortal soul. I would hope that he would pray for his immortal soul. People can believe what they choose to believe. For me, if we really reread and understand our scriptures, we have to move beyond that. As the Quran states, for example, we believe what has been sent down to us, and we believe what has been sent to you. Our God and your God is one, and to him we submit. And the Quran says, we have sent revelations to you as we sent revelations to Noah and the prophets who came after him. And we sent revelations to Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and their offspring, and to Jesus and Job, and to Moses God spoke directly. Because no one religion can claim a monopoly on God, on love of God, on social justice, on mercy, on compassion, on mysticism, or perfect government on earth, both Christians and Muslims need to recognize that both religions contain elements of truth about how individuals ought to live and how society ought to operate, and how we ought to interact. The golden rule of the Gospels in Luke's Gospel is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Gospels don't mean just do unto other Christians or do unto Catholics or just do unto other Protestants. If you read the Gospels in our world today, if you listen to Pope Francis, as well as John Paul II in the past, but certainly Pope Francis, we see that recognition. Then we have the document, as I said, of a common word which I talked about before. And from that approach, one can conclude then with the prominent Catholic theologian Hans Küng, his observation, there will be no peace among peoples of this world without peace among the world religions. You know, when you hear that statement, it just sounds so obvious and ordinary. So I look at it and think, well, that's nice that Hans said it, but so what? But you actually look at it in terms of not only ancient history, past history, but even the history that some of us who have hair that's a little bit like mine, and some of us who don't have hair, and some of us who arrange that our hair does not look like mine. However they use that, whether it's Clairol or anything else that you use in this part of the world. We know that in the past, many of us weren't trained to think that way. That the implications that you cannot have peace among peoples in this world without peace among our world religions. Think about not just the problem of terrorism and extremism, think about the problems that we're having, regrettably, in the upsurge of problems with attacks on Christians from Nigeria to Malaysia, and in countries that often we wouldn't expect it. Now that doesn't represent the majority of the population, but the fact that there's been that upsurge, and that overshadows the fact of the relations that exist in many countries. So we need to move forward. Conclusion. In an age of globalization and communications, travel, religions, and of globalization of religious extremism, all are challenged to understand and respect religious and cultural traditions of others, and to distinguish that bright, transcendent side and that dark side. The mainstream of a religion versus the extremist. I can't get too specific. It wouldn't matter because it won't get back, but coming here, I had a driver whom I know really well who was taking me in Washington to the airport. And this is somebody who was raised in South Asia, of one of the religions in South Asia, but not Islam. And he's the nicest person in the world. Great sense of humor, everything. I mean, really has a good sense of humor. In fact, he told me that the last time he saw my wife, he picked up my wife and the dispatcher said, confusing picking me up from picking somebody else. He said, now when you pick up, he didn't say Dr. so-and-so, he said, the doctor's wife, remember the doctor died. So he said to me, I picked your wife up. First thing I said is, I'm so sorry. Your wife said, sorry about what? He said, it got really awkward. I didn't know what word to use. Do I say, you died? That you passed away? You know? He said, so I said that your husband passed away. And she said, my husband passed away? I just talked to him. He's okay. So we're having this conversation. As we get closer to the airport, now we've had many conversations. He finally said to me, because we've become somewhat friendly, you know a lot about Islam. I said, well, I do a lot of writing. He said, what is it about their religion? So I started talking about extremists. He said, no. I don't just mean extremists. He said, I'm talking about the problem is not just that they're extremists, it's in their religion itself. Now, I could have said to him, you know, if you look at your religious tradition, it's one of the South Asian religious traditions, and if you look at recent years, you've had your extremists too. And in fact, I cited something. And he said, this is what believers always do. Yeah, but they're an exception. You know, they were an exception. That doesn't really come from my faith. You know, but their faith has a problem. I was talking to a very, very well-educated and sophisticated professional that I was dealing with over a period of 2 years. And we were dealing with other professional things, but he knew what I did. And so he made some comments about Islam and jihad. And then after 2 years, he said, I get it, John. He said, I understand now, and I understand better. I distinguish better with regard to Islam and extremism. He said, I understand now that the problem is that the challenge for Muslim religious leaders is to convince people that they don't have to follow the Quran and kill Christians and Jews. I said, oh boy, it's like teaching an undergraduate who tells you it's a great course, and then they wind up saying something that's just the opposite of what you've been saying. These things are so embedded in us. You know, some of you have heard that when I grew up, in my family, a mixed marriage was marrying a non-Italian. Not marrying, you know, a Jew or a Muslim, a non-Italian, okay? Well, I had one uncle, the only uncle who married an Irish person. She was Catholic, but my grandmother would look at the Irish person and say, you see what they're like? It wasn't enough that she was Catholic. You know, like, they're so different than we are, you know? See, your aunt is very nice, but she drinks too much, right? My uncle drank too much too, but that was different. He was a son, he was a man, and as I say to my wife often when we have differences, but I'm exceptional, I'm Italian. She's not Italian. Okay, so our challenge then is to instead educate our religious leaders, priests, imams, rabbis, educate our young people, the next generation, who will then become the parents. And remember, for many, it's the religious leader and the parents that with children give them their first view of the world. To help them to realize, yes, celebrate their tradition, but to understand the richness and diversity that exists within their societies, in their multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies. Differences can be a problem, but diversity can be something rich. Think about when you create a mosaic. You don't use the same exact color. You don't necessarily have to use the same exact stone. A mosaic can create a thing of beauty. And the same thing is true in terms of our approach. Muslims and Christians are challenged to embrace a religious inclusivism that, while not compromising their faith, avoids an exclusivism that undermines a healthy religious pluralism, and that feeds into religious and intra-religious conflict. Today there are conflicts between Sunni and Shia. Today there are conflicts between very conservative, hardline Christians and members of their own Christian denomination. We see divisions. Lutherans break into two separate groups. Protestants break into groups. We see divisions between very conservative Protestants and Catholics and more, quote, liberal, or whatever you want to call the other side. So we have to move beyond that. It doesn't mean that we deny the differences, but we move forward. Here's what I see at its best, coming from a variety of Muslim religious leaders, whom I won't mention tonight, lest I favor one over the other. But if you buy my book, The Future of Islam, you will read about it, and I can use the royalties, so I encourage you. And I will cite the example of Pope Francis, who does not deny the differences, not only between faiths, but even among Catholics, but talks about the need to be able to get on with it, to accept the differences, and to move forward because we have a shared future. Both need to denounce, both faiths, to denounce and marginalize their preachers of hate. Preachers of hate can be both nonviolent and violent. Preacher of hate that's nonviolent can still preach a world that is divided, that is necessarily divided. Preach principles and values that keep people separated and apart, rather than acknowledging differences, but talking about how we move forward. Rather than acknowledging that we share, if we believe in God, a shared belief in God. If we do not believe in God, shared sets of values. And that we have this shared set of even interests. So if we can't all get along because of our faith or values, we ought to realize we have shared interests. And move forward. Followers of Christianity and Judaism are specifically challenged today to become more aware of Islam, to acknowledge their Muslim brothers and sisters as children of Abraham. Muslims need to follow the lead of Islamic reformers, just as Christians need to follow the lead of Christian reformers, and emphasize the interconnection of all the people of the book, and that they share a common humanity, should share a common citizenship, and common human rights. Not only religious leaders, but also schools and universities and seminaries and families need to inculcate those values. If they're just things that a small group of people do, if we have the Pope and a group of cardinals, and we have a group of grand muftis and not so grand muftis, and we have whatever, patriarchs, etc., and they sign documents unless they make sure that the education of their religious leaders and their seminaries is one which not only teaches them their faith, but also to understand other faiths. And unless we do that in our educational system, unless we can get it so that it occurs within families, it's not going to happen. Finally, all people of faith need to remember what I began with. Avoid pious, religious, but historical amnesia. Okay? Affirm pious history, but avoid the amnesia. You know, we all feel we have a great faith. We all have a sense of history when we look at past history of periods of victimhood. You know, whether it's Christians looking to Islam or Muslims looking the other way. I'll end with this example, since I'm in an audience which has Christians but has quite a few Muslims. When I was a young academic, I went to the University of Chicago to read a paper, and I was very nervous because everybody else was a superstar, a scholar. And I was very, very junior. And I also had to catch a plane to go home. And they had me as number 4 on the panel. The chair was very nice. Now, he could have put me up as number 1 or 2. He still left me at 4. But note how he tried to move the panel along. He said, can I ask my Muslim brothers, 3 of the speakers were Muslim, and then there was me. Okay. Can I ask my Muslim brothers to skip the part about the Crusades and European colonialism and get to the heart of their paper? That will shorten their paper, you know, and provide more of a focus. Okay? And the same thing happens when you get the reverse wrap. So to show you the reverse wrap, I get on a plane, and it's in Washington. I've got to do this carefully. And on the plane comes a man about 6'4". I don't know how to express that in meters. Okay, I don't deal in meters, but let's say he's about this much taller than I am. Okay, has a long beard, long hair, blue cassock, okay, blue robes. Okay, and we're sitting in first class. Why shouldn't we? Right? We're elites. No, we both got bumped up. You know, got raised. That wasn't true, but it didn't sound better. It makes it sound more proletarian, when you put it this way. So we're sitting there. It turns out, and he looked very foreign to me, you know? I mean, I figured he was born overseas. No, he was born in New York City, the way I was. As soon as he started to talk, we talked exactly the same way. Think about how people in economy, though, are looking at him, okay? Given the way he's dressed. But we're talking, and he said to me at some point, and he's very open-minded, he said, but you know, I have to say that when I see Hasidic Jews, you know, who have the curls, you know, and they wear the black hat, he said, they don't seem to fit in New York. I'm uncomfortable with that. He said, and then, you know, I'm very respectful of Muslims, but some of them, they have those hats and those beards, you know? And then as we're talking, he said to me, you know, I'm not trying to justify the kinds of problems that exist in some parts of the world, but you have to remember that some people don't forget what happened 4 and 5 centuries ago. I said, yeah, they might not forget what happened 4 or 5 centuries ago, but they can't be reclaiming it as if it's happening right now. You know, the victimhood of the past, you can't be a perpetual victim because of that. And I think that that is our challenge. So I leave you tonight by thanking you for coming. I thank you for listening to me. But I would also thank you, those of you who aren't involved, to realize that the one thing global terrorism has taught us is that knowledge about other people's faiths is not something esoteric. It's not something you can choose. That simply thinking that you don't have any extremists is extraordinarily naive. And that we live in a world that is so interconnected that when anything occurs in the world, it can not only affect our security, it can affect the economy of the world. Think about the fallout after 9/11. And think about all the implications. If you travel, think about the implications if you happen to be a Muslim today and you travel, and it's 10 years later. And I'll end with a statistic. There was a recent study done comparing 2001 to 2011. And they looked at the portrayal of the Muslim world and of Islam in the media. 975,000 media reports, okay? Print media and TV, BBC, ABC, MSNBC, New York Times, Guardian, etc. 975,000. Look at during the year, I think it was 2011. And it compared the coverage of Islam and Muslims there to the coverage in 2001. Note what I'm going to say. I'll try to say this very slowly. In 2001, if you looked at coverage of the Muslim world and of Islam, 2% of the media coverage focused on extremism. And the problem was that coverage of mainstream Muslim world, what's going on among most Muslims, Muslim families, mainstream faith, was only 0.1%. Got it? Now, move to 2011. 2011, the coverage of extremism goes from 2% to 28%. Big gap. The coverage of mainstream stories on mainstream Muslims remains at 0.1%. We neither want to see that in our media, nor do we want to see that in our societies, in our faith, and in our families. Thank you.